The huntress stalked her human prey for a week in the jungle, but she became the prey. Deep in the heart of the lush, alien jungle, the silence was alive with tension. Tall trees stretched endlessly skyward, their thick canopies painting the ground below in perpetual green shadows. The air hummed with life, chirps, roars, and unrecognizable clicks from creatures that lurked unseen. This was the hunting ground, a proving arena for the Xian, a predator species renowned for their cunning and skill. The huntress, Lyrics, crouched high on a thick branch, her sharp, scaled fingers gripping a pulse blade. Her target? A human. Humans were new to this part of the galaxy, a race underestimated by the Xian and many others. They were weak, small, and lacked the natural weaponry or agility that apex predators like Lyrics possessed. But her pride was on the line. This hunt was not just about dominance, it was personal. The human, a male named Connor, had stumbled into their sacred hunting ground a week ago, entirely by accident. His crash landing had disrupted Lyrics's ceremonial hunt, earning him the label of prey. As tradition dictated, he had 7 days to evade her before she claimed his life, and for every day he survived, her disgrace grew. But now, she had him. She could feel it. Through her helmet's vision filter, she spotted movement below. The human moved cautiously, holding a crude weapon, a stick sharpened into a spear. He was shirtless, his body slick with sweat, and his face smeared with mud in a futile attempt at camouflage. A smile tugged at her lips. Pathetic. She tracked him silently from the treetops, her movements fluid and precise. Her thermal vision picked up his heat signature, erratic and glowing, as he stumbled over the thick roots that snaked across the forest floor. He had been clever enough to evade her for days, using traps, covering his tracks, and even doubling back to confuse her. But his exhaustion was showing, and Lyrics knew the hunt was nearly over. Leaping from branch to branch, she closed the distance between them. A small clearing opened ahead, sunlight piercing through the dense canopy. This was her moment. From her belt, she retrieved a net launcher, a high-tech weapon capable of immobilizing even the most powerful prey. She lined up her shot. But just as her finger tightened on the trigger, a sharp whistle pierced the air. She froze. The sound was subtle, almost lost in the jungle's chorus, but it was deliberate. Her eyes scanned the area, her helmet enhancing the faintest movements. The human had vanished. A flicker of unease crept up her spine. No prey had ever eluded her for this long. Humans were not supposed to be this resourceful. And yet, this one had evaded her, set traps that nearly injured her, and now he was playing tricks. Her instincts screamed at her to move, and just as she shifted her weight, the branch beneath her groaned, a rope trap. Before she could react, the branch snapped upward, flinging her into the air. She twisted mid-flight, her reflexes saving her from a deadly fall, but the landing was far from graceful. Lyrics hit the ground hard, rolling to absorb the impact. Her pulse blade clattered beside her. The jungle came alive with noise, birds scattering, creatures growling at the disturbance. She scrambled to her feet, pulse pounding. And then she heard it. The low rumble of a voice, too deep to belong to any alien creature she knew. Thought you were the only one hunting, huh? Connor stepped into the clearing, his spear in hand. The mud on his face highlighted the cold determination in his eyes. The sweat and exhaustion were still there, but so was something else, a spark of defiance. Lyrics reached for her blade, but her hand froze as a sharp whistle sounded again. This time, she recognized it for what it was, a signal. From the shadows emerged several crude traps Connor had set around the clearing, sharpened stakes, rockfall mechanisms, and a cleverly concealed pit. The realization hit her. She wasn't the only predator here. Connor smirked. You've been stalking me for days, but I've been watching you too. For the first time in her life, Lyrics felt the prickling chill of vulnerability. The huntress had become the hunted. The jungle around them fell eerily silent, the weight of the moment pressing in. Lyrics gritted her teeth, the pulse blade humming to life in her grip. If this human thought he could turn the tables, he would learn the hard way that Ian never surrendered. But deep inside, a voice whispered, "You underestimated him." And she wondered if this jungle would be her tomb. Lyrix's muscles coiled like steel springs as she held her pulse blade firmly, its edge glowing faintly in the dim light of the clearing. Across from her, Connor stood with his makeshift spear. The difference between them was stark. She, a trained predator bred for the hunt, and he, a survivor who had stumbled into this world unprepared. Yet there was no fear in his eyes, only determination. She moved first, dashing to the left, feinting in approach. Her agility was unmatched, her lithe form almost a blur as she zigzagged through the dense foliage surrounding the clearing. She had always relied on her speed to overwhelm her prey, but this human was quick to adapt. Connor shifted his stance, staying light on his feet. His spear wasn't just a weapon, it was an extension of his will, and he held it steady, tracking her movements. "You think you're faster," he said, his voice calm despite the tension. "Maybe you are. But speed means nothing when you don't know the ground beneath you." Lyrix didn't respond. She never wasted words on prey. Actions spoke louder, and she planned to let her blade do the talking. She lunged. Her blade arced downward in a flash of light, aimed to disarm him in a single strike. But just as the blade neared his shoulder, Connor twisted, sidestepping the attack with uncanny precision. His spear jabbed out, forcing her to pivot away to avoid being skewered. "Close," Connor muttered. "But not close enough." Lyrix's frustration mounted. She wasn't accustomed to being countered so effectively. The Xeran were unparalleled hunters, yet this human, this fragile, weaponless creature, was not only surviving but challenging her dominance. But then she noticed something. His foot placement was deliberate, guiding her movements toward a specific area of the clearing. She glanced around and realized the subtle pattern in the ground. Vines twisted unnaturally, branches broken in precise ways. The trap. Her instincts screamed at her to retreat, but it was too late. Connor grinned, and with a sharp tug on a hidden rope, the ground beneath her collapsed. The earth gave way, and Lyrix plummeted into a narrow pit lined with jagged stakes. She twisted in midair, using her athleticism to grab the edge of the pit before she could fall too far. The stakes scraped against her armor, sending sparks flying as she hauled herself up with sheer force. Connor was ready. As soon as her hand emerged, he slammed the butt of his spear into her wrist, forcing her to let go. She fell back into the pit, landing hard against the stakes, though her armor absorbed the brunt of the impact. The human peered over the edge, his expression grim. "You underestimated me." "Big mistake." Lyrix growled in frustration, gripping one of the stakes and snapping it free. The primitive weapon was crude, but in her hands, it could become lethal. With a burst of power, she leapt from the pit, using her momentum to clear the edge entirely. Connor barely had time to react as she swung the stake at him, aiming for his head. He ducked, narrowly avoiding the blow, and jabbed at her with his spear. She dodged, the sharp point grazing her armor. The jungle erupted into chaos. Birds scattered into the skies, and the underbrush trembled with the movements of fleeing creatures. The two of them were locked in a deadly dance, their clash a violent blur of instincts and strategy. Lyrix felt a shift in her mindset. This human wasn't just prey anymore. He was an equal adversary, and that realization both infuriated and intrigued her. Their battle wove through the jungle, each combatant using the terrain to their advantage. Lyrix leapt from tree to tree, raining down attacks, while Connor stayed low, weaving between roots and vines, forcing her to chase him. But the human's stamina was remarkable. She could see it now. His weeks in the jungle had honed him in ways she hadn't anticipated. He wasn't stronger than her, but his endurance, his cunning, and his ability to learn from each clash were turning the tide. In one swift motion, Connor ducked under a swipe of her pulse blade and drove his spear into the ground at an angle. The move wasn't meant to strike her, it was a setup. The spear triggered a mechanism hidden beneath the dirt, releasing a cascade of rocks from the treetops above. The heavy stones fell like a deadly rain. Lyrix dodged most of them, but one struck her shoulder, knocking her off balance. She tumbled to the ground, her pulse blade skittering out of reach. Connor didn't press the attack. Instead, he circled her, his spear pointed toward her chest. His breathing was heavy, his body glistening with sweat, but his gaze was sharp. "Why do this?" he demanded, his voice cutting through the chaos. What's the point of this hunt? You're out here risking your life for what? Pride? Lyrics snarled, baring her teeth. She lunged for her blade, but Connor stepped forward, kicking it away before she could grab it. No, he said, shaking his head. Not this time. If you want me, you'll have to face me barehanded. For a moment, there was only silence between them, the jungle holding its breath. Lyrics's pride burned at the challenge, but deep inside, something else flickered. Respect. She stood, her hands clenched into fists. If he wanted a fight, she would give him one. And this time, it would be on equal terms. The tension in the jungle thickened like a fog as Lyrics squared her shoulders, her eyes locked on Connor. Her pulse blade lay in the dirt, her primary advantage discarded. For a Xeran huntress, this was sacrilege. To fight without weapons was primitive, savage. But so was this human. Connor's chest rose and fell as he gripped his spear, the sharp edge aimed at her, but his posture was more defensive than aggressive. He wasn't trying to kill her, not yet. Lyrics realized what he was doing, testing her. Her pride flared, and without warning, she charged. She closed the distance between them in an instant, her speed and agility propelling her like a bullet. Connor braced himself, his spear thrusting forward to meet her advance, but she twisted at the last second, ducking under the weapon. Her claws flashed out, slicing through the shaft of the spear and leaving him with little more than a jagged stick. Connor stumbled back but recovered quickly, swinging the broken spear in an arc. The makeshift weapon caught her across the arm, the impact jarring but harmless against her armor. Lyrics smirked, the thrill of combat igniting in her chest. This human fought with desperation, but also ingenuity. She lashed out with a sweeping kick, aiming to knock him off his feet. Connor jumped back, but his footing faltered on the uneven terrain. Lyrics seized the moment, lunging forward to pin him down. But Connor wasn't as off-balance as he appeared. As she moved in, he pivoted, using her momentum against her. He grabbed her arm and twisted, sending her sprawling into the dirt. Lyrics growled in frustration, flipping onto her feet with feline grace. Connor pressed his advantage, swinging the jagged stick at her head. She ducked, her reflexes sharp, and drove her shoulder into his chest. The force sent him stumbling into a tree, the impact knocking the wind out of him. "Is this all you have?" she hissed, her voice dripping with contempt. Connor coughed, straightening. "Oh, I've got more." He shot back, wiping blood from the corner of his mouth. He darted toward her, feinting with the stick before dropping low and sweeping his leg out. The unexpected move caught her off guard, and she felt herself falling. She hit the ground hard, the air rushing from her lungs. Connor didn't waste time. He dropped the stick and lunged at her, pinning her arms to the ground. For a moment, they struggled, their faces inches apart. Lyrics thrashed beneath him, her claws scratching at his arms, but he held on, his strength surprising for a human. "Why?" he demanded again, his voice rough. "Why hunt me? What's the point of this?" Lyrics bared her teeth, her pride warring with the faintest flicker of doubt. "It is my right," she spat. "You trespassed in sacred ground. You became prey." Connor's grip tightened. "I didn't choose this. I didn't crash here to offend you or your gods. But I'm not dying to prove your point." His words struck a chord she hadn't expected. The Xeran hunted because it was their tradition, their way of proving dominance. But as she stared into Connor's eyes, she saw no fear, no submission. He didn't see her as superior, just as another being fighting to survive. The realization unsettled her. With a burst of strength, Lyrics shoved him off, rolling to her feet. She stood, chest heaving, her claws flexing. Connor rose as well, his body tense but his expression unyielding. The fight wasn't over, but something had shifted. "You're different," Lyrics said, her voice quieter now. Connor shrugged, his lip curling in a tired smirk. "Humans are full of surprises." She tilted her head, studying him. He wasn't like any prey she'd ever faced. He had adapted, learned her movements, anticipated her strategies. In her culture, that level of resilience demanded respect. The jungle seemed to echo her hesitation, the usual cacophony of sounds muted as if the world itself was holding its breath. Connor stepped back, lowering his hands. You can keep hunting me if you want, he said, his tone steady. But I'm not going down without a fight. Lyrics narrowed her eyes, her claws twitching. She could finish this now, strike him down and reclaim her honor. But the thought tasted bitter. Was this what the hunt was supposed to be? A show of brute force, a display of superiority? Or was it a test, not of strength, but of understanding? She took a step forward, her posture relaxing slightly. You've earned your life today, human, she said, her voice carrying the weight of an unexpected truth. But this jungle is not done with you. Connor frowned, unsure if her words were a threat or a warning. Before he could respond, Lyrics turned and disappeared into the trees, her movements as silent as the shadows. He stood there, alone in the clearing, the adrenaline slowly draining from his body. He didn't know whether to feel relieved or wary. Above, the jungle canopy rustled, and for the first time, Connor wondered if the hunt was truly over, or if it had just begun. Connor remained motionless, his body still tense as he watched the shadows where Lyrics had vanished. The silence of the jungle was unnerving, each rustle of leaves or distant cry of a creature reminding him he wasn't alone. He leaned against a tree, catching his breath, his mind racing. Had she truly let him go, or was this another tactic? Her words echoed in his ears. This jungle is not done with you. He knew better than to trust her retreat. Survival wasn't just about strength but vigilance. Gripping what was left of his broken spear, Connor moved cautiously, weaving through the dense underbrush. He needed water, food, time to recover. But the jungle offered no mercy. Hours passed, the oppressive heat sapping his energy. The forest seemed alive, the air thick with the feeling of being watched. The Xeran huntress might have left, but the jungle itself had taken her place, a constant, silent predator. Connor paused by a stream, dipping his hands into the cool water. His reflection stared back at him, dirt-streaked and wild-eyed. He barely recognized himself. A branch snapped behind him. He spun, heart pounding, his jagged spear raised. A figure emerged, not Lyrics but something far worse. It was a predator native to the jungle, its 6 legs moving with deadly grace, its serrated claws glinting in the filtered sunlight. Connor took a step back, his pulse quickening. The creature growled low, its alien eyes fixed on him. He tightened his grip on the spear, knowing there was no running from this. The creature lunged, and Connor dodged, jabbing the spear into its flank. It roared, swiping at him with a claw that narrowly missed his chest. He stumbled, falling hard against a tree, his weapon ripped from his hands. The beast loomed over him, saliva dripping from its maw. Connor braced himself for the end. But then, a sharp whistle pierced the air. The creature froze, its head snapping toward the sound. Connor followed its gaze and saw her, Lyrics, perched high in the trees, her pulse blade glowing once more. In one fluid motion, she leapt from the branch, landing squarely on the creature's back. Her blade sank into its neck, and with a guttural cry, the beast collapsed, twitching before going still. Connor stared, stunned, as Lyrics stood, pulling her blade free. She turned to him, her expression unreadable. "You're not ready for this jungle, human," she said coldly. "But you've earned my protection. For now." Connor pushed himself to his feet, his confusion giving way to cautious gratitude. "Why help me?" Lyrics didn't answer immediately. She wiped the blood from her blade and glanced at him. "The hunt is over. For now we survive." Without waiting for his response, she turned and began walking deeper into the jungle. Connor hesitated but followed. For now they were no longer predator and prey, but uneasy allies. Connor trailed behind Lyrics, his steps cautious and his eyes darting between the shadows. The jungle felt even more hostile now, as though the death of the predator had stirred something in its depths. Lyrics moved silently, her presence commanding the space around her. Though she had saved him, Connor didn't trust her entirely. Why had she changed her mind? Was she leading him into another trap? "Why are you doing this?" he finally asked, his voice cutting through the thick air. She didn't stop walking. "You survived longer than expected." No Xeran huntress would ignore that. "It's significant." "That's not an answer," Connor said, keeping his distance. Lyrics halted abruptly, turning to face him. You don't understand, human. The hunt isn't just about killing. It's about respect, earning it, giving it. You've earned enough to live for now. Don't question it. Connor frowned but let it drop. He wasn't in a position to push her for more. They pressed on, the jungle growing darker as evening approached. The humid air clung to them, and every sound seemed amplified, the snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves. Connor couldn't shake the feeling they were being watched. Suddenly, Lyrics raised a hand, motioning for him to stop. She crouched low, her sharp eyes scanning the undergrowth. What is it? Connor whispered, gripping the jagged spear he'd scavenged earlier. She didn't reply immediately, her head tilting as if listening to something only she could hear. Then, with a sharp motion, she pointed to a nearby tree. Climb. No. Connor didn't argue. He scrambled up the thick trunk, his muscles screaming in protest. Lyrics followed with effortless grace, positioning herself on a higher branch. From their perch, Connor saw it, a swarm of smaller predators, each about the size of a dog, skittering across the jungle floor. Their sleek, black bodies moved in unison, their glowing red eyes scanning the ground. Carrion hunters, Lyrics muttered. They've caught the scent of the kill. Connor swallowed hard, gripping the branch tighter. They can climb, can't they? Lyrics glanced at him, a faint smirk tugging at her lips. Yes. Stay ready. As if on cue, the creatures reached the base of the tree, their claws scraping against the bark as they began to ascend. Lyrics activated her pulse blade, its hum filling the air. Focus on the smaller ones. They'll target you first. Connor nodded, his grip tightening on the spear. He knew this wasn't just another fight for survival, it was a test. The first creature lunged, and the battle began. The first predator leapt onto Connor's branch, its glowing eyes locked on him. He thrust his jagged spear forward, piercing its torso. The creature let out a shriek before falling back to the jungle floor, but more were already climbing, their claws scraping furiously against the bark. Above him, Lyrics moved with precision. Her pulse blade sliced through the air, severing limbs and driving the swarm back. She balanced on the narrow branch effortlessly, her movements a mix of instinct and training. Keep moving, she barked. They'll overwhelm you if you stay still. Connor didn't need to be told twice. He scrambled up to a higher branch, narrowly dodging another predator that lunged for his leg. He swung the broken spear like a club, smashing it against the creature's head. It screeched, falling back into the swarm below. Lyrics landed beside him in a fluid motion, her blade glowing faintly in the dim light. They're testing us, she said, her voice calm despite the chaos. Testing us? They're trying to eat us. Connor shouted, slamming the butt of his spear into another attacker. Lyrics glanced at him, her expression unreadable. Same thing. The swarm grew more aggressive, their shrill cries filling the air. They were relentless, climbing faster, their numbers seeming endless. Connor's arms burned from swinging the spear, and his footing became less sure with each attack. Suddenly, Lyrics pointed to a nearby tree. Jump. Now. Connor hesitated. The gap was wide, and the branch he was on felt unstable. Do it, she snapped, slicing through two more predators in a single swing. Gritting his teeth, Connor leapt. For a terrifying moment, he thought he'd misjudged the distance, but his hands caught the branch, and he hauled himself up. Lyrics followed, landing beside him with a grace that made his effort look clumsy. The predators swarmed their previous perch, but their momentum had slowed. Lyrics's calculated strikes and Connor's desperate defense had thinned their numbers. Finally, a sharp, guttural roar echoed through the jungle. The remaining creatures froze, their heads snapping toward the sound. Without hesitation, they retreated, vanishing into the shadows as quickly as they'd appeared. Connor collapsed against the trunk, panting heavily. What was that? Lyrics deactivated her blade, her gaze fixed on the darkness. They're alpha. It called them back. Connor stared at her, still catching his breath. You think it'll come for us? Lyrics's lips curved into a faint, almost predatory smile. Will. But when it does, we'll be ready. For the first time, Connor realized she wasn't just a hunter, She was also a survivor, just like him. And together they might just stand a chance. The jungle was eerily silent after the swarm retreated, the oppressive stillness settling heavily over Connor and Lyrics. They perched on the broad branch, catching their breath, their eyes scanning the shadows below. Every flicker of movement sent a jolt of tension through Connor's body. "You didn't have to save me," he said after a long pause, his voice low. Lyrics didn't look at him, her sharp eyes still watching the jungle. "You wouldn't have lasted another day. My reasons are my own." Connor frowned, gripping the broken spear in his hand. "You keep talking like this is some noble act. But let's be honest, you're just biding your time. Aren't you?" Lyrics turned to him, her expression unreadable. For a moment she said nothing, then replied, "I hunt because it is what I was made for. You survived longer than any prey I've faced. That means something to my kind. But don't mistake respect for loyalty." "Noted," Connor muttered, leaning back against the tree trunk. The hours passed in tense quiet. Lyrics didn't rest, her body still and coiled like a predator ready to strike. Connor's exhaustion, however, eventually overcame his paranoia, and he dozed off, clutching the spear tightly. He woke to a faint growl. Lyrics was already standing, her pulse blade in hand, her posture rigid. "It's here," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Connor blinked the sleep from his eyes, his heart pounding as he looked into the darkness. The jungle seemed alive with movement, the shadows twisting unnaturally. And then he saw it, the Alpha. The creature was massive, far larger than the others. Its sleek, black body rippled with muscle, and its glowing red eyes burned with intelligence. Unlike the swarm, it moved slowly, deliberately, as though it knew it had the upper hand. Lyrics stepped forward, her blade humming to life. "Stay behind me," she ordered. Connor didn't argue. He tightened his grip on his makeshift weapon, his palms slick with sweat. The Alpha stopped just below them, its eyes fixed on Lyrics. It let out a low, rumbling growl that seemed to shake the very tree they stood on. Lyrics's lips curled into a fierce grin. "It knows we're a threat?" Before Connor could respond, the Alpha lunged, its claws ripping through the trunk. The tree shuddered violently, and both of them had to grab onto branches to keep from falling. Lyrics leapt down, meeting the creature head-on. Her blade flashed in the dim light, slicing through the air with precision. The Alpha dodged with surprising speed, swiping at her with razor-sharp claws. Connor watched in awe and terror as the two predators clashed. Lyrics was fast, but the Alpha was relentless, its movements powerful and calculated. "Connor!" she shouted, dodging a blow that splintered the ground beneath her. "It's smarter than the others. You need to flank it." Connor hesitated, his survival instincts screaming at him to stay put. But then he saw the Alpha gain the upper hand, pinning Lyrics against a tree. Gripping his broken spear, he slid down from the tree and darted toward the fight. The Alpha, focused on Lyrics, didn't see him coming. He plunged the spear into its side with all his strength. The creature roared in pain, its attention snapping to Connor. Lyrics seized the opening, driving her blade into its throat. The Alpha thrashed violently, but her strike was precise, severing its lifeline. With one final shudder, the beast collapsed. Connor stood over it, panting, his hands trembling. Lyrics stepped back, her breathing heavy, her armor streaked with the creature's blood. "You're full of surprises," she said, her voice carrying a hint of admiration. Connor gave a weak laugh. "You're not so bad yourself." For the first time, Lyrics smiled, just slightly. The hunt was over, but something unspoken lingered between them. In this jungle, they had become more than hunter and prey. They had become something neither had expected. The jungle felt heavier after the Alpha's death. The stillness was no longer one of tension but of uneasy calm, as if the jungle itself was acknowledging the end of a predator. Connor and Lyrics stood over the beast's massive body, their breaths ragged and their muscles trembling with exhaustion. Connor broke the silence. "We should move. That thing might have been the Alpha, but who knows what else is out there." Lyrics nodded, wiping the blood from her blade before deactivating it. "Agreed. This kill will draw scavengers." The two set off deeper into the jungle, their steps quieter now, their senses heightened. For the first time, They moved in unspoken coordination, watching each other's backs. Connor noticed how Lyrix's movements had changed. She was no longer keeping him at arm's length. Instead, she seemed protective. After hours of trekking, they reached a small clearing. A massive tree with hollowed roots offered some semblance of shelter. Lyrix inspected the area before gesturing for Connor to rest. He slumped against the tree, wincing as he checked the fresh scratches and bruises along his arms. Lyrix crouched nearby, her sharp gaze scanning the jungle's edge. "Why didn't you just kill me earlier?" Connor asked, breaking the silence. She didn't look at him. "You fought." "Most prey doesn't." "That's it?" Lyrix hesitated, her claws tapping lightly against the bark of the tree. "You're more than prey. That's why I stopped." Connor stared at her. The admission wasn't much, but coming from her, it felt monumental. As night fell, the jungle came alive with distant calls and rustling leaves. Connor couldn't sleep, his mind replaying the events of the day. "Lyrix," he said softly, glancing at her. She was seated nearby, her pulse blade resting across her lap. "What? Do you think this is over? The jungle, the predators, everything?" Lyrix's golden eyes met his. "No," she said simply. "It's never over. Not here." Connor sighed, his grip tightening on the broken spear beside him. "Then what's the plan?" Lyrix leaned back against the tree, her expression unreadable. "We survive. Together." The word hung in the air, surprising both of them. It wasn't what Connor had expected, but he nodded, understanding the truth in it. Alone, they wouldn't last long. Together, they might stand a chance. For now, the jungle watched, waiting for its next move. Morning came slowly, the faint light breaking through the thick canopy of the jungle. Connor stirred, his body aching from exhaustion, but the sounds of distant predators pushed him to his feet. Lyrix was already awake, standing watch with her pulse blade in hand. "We need to keep moving," she said without looking at him. Connor grabbed his broken spear and nodded. He didn't question her anymore. Over the past days, she had proven her instincts were the difference between life and death in this place. The two moved cautiously, the jungle's oppressive atmosphere pressing down on them. As they navigated through dense undergrowth, Lyrix suddenly raised her hand, signaling Connor to stop. "There's something ahead," she whispered. Connor peered past her and saw it, an enormous, ancient ruin covered in vines and moss. Its towering walls were cracked, but it still stood defiantly amidst the encroaching jungle. "What is that?" Connor asked, his voice barely audible. "A relic," Lyrix replied. "Zeun do not build such things. It's old, older than us." The structure radiated a strange energy, one that sent a shiver down Connor's spine. They approached cautiously, Lyrix leading the way. The entrance was wide and dark, the interior hidden in shadow. "We shouldn't go in," Connor said uneasily. Lyrix glanced back at him, her golden eyes sharp. "If we stay out here, we're exposed. Whatever is inside, we'll face it together." Reluctantly, Connor followed her into the ruins. The air was cooler inside, the silence almost deafening. Strange carvings adorned the walls, depicting creatures neither of them recognized. As they moved deeper, a faint hum filled the air. Lyrix's grip on her pulse blade tightened. "This place isn't empty," she muttered. Connor's unease grew with every step. What could be here after all this time? They rounded a corner and froze. In the center of a large chamber stood a towering machine, its surface covered in glowing symbols. It pulsed faintly, alive despite its age. "What is that?" Connor whispered. Lyrix approached it cautiously, her eyes narrowing. "A beacon, or a weapon? I can't tell." Suddenly, the hum grew louder, and the room trembled. The jungle outside roared to life, as if responding to the ancient machine. Connor stepped back, panic creeping into his voice. "What did you do?" Lyrix didn't answer. Her eyes were locked on the machine, her expression a mix of fear and fascination. The jungle wasn't the only predator they'd been fighting. Something far older, far deadlier, had just awakened.